The night the train stopped was the coldest the station had seen in decades. The kind of cold that crept through wool coats and froze breath in the lungs before it ever made it to the air. The kind of cold that made even the most hurried travelers slow down and curse under their breath. The old station sat like a forgotten relic on the edge of the prairie, its yellow lights flickering, its clock stuck 5 minutes behind time, its benches cracked and worn smooth by generations of people who had passed through but never stayed. That was where he saw her. She was sitting on the far bench beneath the broken departure board, shoulders hunched, hands bare, fingers blue, her head bowed as if she were praying or simply too tired to keep it up any longer. She wore a thin jacket that had no business being worn in winter, scrubs visible beneath it, wrinkled and stained in ways that spoke of long shifts and little rest. Most people would have assumed she was waiting for someone who would never come, or that she had made a mistake and would soon stand up and leave. But something about the stillness of her, the way she didn't move even when the wind cut through the station like a blade, told him she wasn't waiting anymore. She was enduring, and for reasons he couldn't explain, despite the fact that he owned more land than some counties and had spent his life learning not to involve himself where he didn't belong. He stopped walking. The sound of his boots echoed too loudly on the concrete as he turned, hat pulled low, coat heavy on his shoulders, eyes fixed on a stranger who looked like she might not survive the night. If no one noticed her, he wasn't supposed to be there. He hated trains, hated cities, hated places where the sky felt too small and the ground didn't answer back when you stepped on it. But a delayed private flight, a business deal that couldn't wait, and a stubborn refusal to sleep in a hotel had put him on that platform at nearly midnight, surrounded by people who didn't know his name and wouldn't care if they did. To them, he was just another cowboy-looking man with a scarred jaw and a quiet presence. Not the self-made millionaire rancher whose cattle fed half the state. Not the man whose signature could move markets and whose words still meant something. In a world that had mostly forgotten what that was worth, he'd learned a long time ago that money made things complicated. It attracted the wrong kind of attention, twisted intentions, rewrote stories before they were even lived. That was why he lived simply, dressed plainly, and kept his distance. But as he stood there watching the woman on the bench shiver without moving, all those rules felt suddenly hollow. He told himself to keep walking. He told himself it wasn't his business. He told himself she was probably fine. Then she swayed, just slightly, like a candle about to go out, and that was enough. He crossed the platform without thinking, shrugging, out of his coat as he walked, the decision already made somewhere deeper than logic. When he draped it over her shoulders, she startled, eyes snapping open, dark and glassy with exhaustion, confusion flashing across her face before pride rushed in to cover it. "I'm fine," she said immediately, voice rough, like she'd been saving words all day and didn't have many left. He didn't argue. He just met her gaze, steady and calm, and said quietly, "You're freezing." It wasn't a question, it was an acknowledgement, and something in the way he said it broke through whatever wall she'd built, because her chin trembled before she could stop it. Her name was Clara, and she hadn't planned on ending up there either. She told him that in fragments, words falling out as if once they started, they couldn't be held back anymore. She was a nurse, had been working double shifts for weeks, had sent her last paycheck home to help her mother after the heating went out, had missed her train because an emergency patient coded 10 minutes before the end of her shift, and she refused to leave until someone else took over. The next train wouldn't come until morning. The waiting room was closed for renovations. The nearby motel was full. She'd told herself she could handle a few hours in the cold. She'd handled worse. As she spoke, he listened the way few people ever had, not interrupting, not offering empty reassurances, just standing there like a wall against the wind. When she finished, embarrassed by her own honesty, she tried to give his coat back. He shook his head. "Keep it," he said, "at least until the train comes." They stood there together, strangers bound by circumstance and cold, and for the first time in years, he felt something shift inside him, subtle but undeniable, like the land just before a storm. He didn't know yet that this moment would be written about one day, argued over, studied, called fate by some and coincidence by others. He didn't know that historians would later say this was where it began. All he knew was that when the wind howled and she leaned just slightly closer, without realizing it, he stayed. And history, quiet and patient, took note. Morning crept in slowly, pale and reluctant. The kind of dawn that looked unsure whether it was worth showing up at all. The cold hadn't loosened its hold on the station, but it had softened just enough to let Clara feel her fingers again. And when she realized she was no longer shivering, she understood why. She was wrapped in his coat, thick and heavy, smelling faintly of leather, smoke, and open land. A scent that felt impossibly out of place among the rusted rails and concrete. She hadn't slept. Not really, but she drifted in and out of awareness, anchored by the quiet presence beside her. He never sat down. He leaned against one of the pillars, arms crossed, hat pulled low, eyes scanning the platform the way a man scans a horizon. He knows too well, every so often, he'd glance at her, subtle, almost careful, as if afraid that looking too directly might scare her away. When the station speakers crackled to life and announced the arrival of the morning train, she startled, suddenly embarrassed by how safe she'd felt. She stood too quickly, nearly dizzy, and he reached out without thinking, steadying her with one hand on her elbow. The contact was brief, respectful, but it sent something sharp and unexpected through both of them. She pulled back first, cheeks warming despite the cold. "Thank you," she said, meaning more than the coat, more than the night. He nodded, as if gratitude were something he accepted but didn't collect. "You got somewhere safe to go now?" he asked. She hesitated, just a fraction of a second too long. He noticed. He always noticed they sat on the train together, not because either of them suggested it, but because neither moved when the doors opened. The car was mostly empty, the hum of motion filling the silence between them. Clara stared out the window, watching frost-covered fields slide past, trying to convince herself that what she felt was just exhaustion, just adrenaline, just relief at having survived a long, hard night. But every time the train rocked slightly and she shifted in her seat, she was aware of him beside her, solid and grounded, as if nothing could knock him off course. He told her his name was James, just James, no last name, no explanations. She appreciated that more than she expected. She talked about nursing school, about growing up in a small town she'd sworn she'd never return to, about how life had a way of narrowing your options without asking permission. He listened, occasionally asking questions that surprised her with their thoughtfulness. When she finally asked what he did, he shrugged. "I work land," he said. It was true, just not the whole truth. He didn't mention the ranches, the employees, the contracts, the millions. He didn't mention how people looked at him differently once they knew. He'd learned the hard way that wealth could erase the man underneath if you let it. Clara nodded, satisfied, as if that answer told her exactly what she needed to know. When the train slowed near her stop, reality rushed back in. She stood, handing him his coat. "I won't forget this," she said softly. He took the coat but didn't put it on right away. "Neither will I," he replied, and for a moment, it felt like something unfinished hung between them, fragile and dangerous and alive. They would have parted there, their story reduced to a memory that surfaced only on sleepless nights, if fate hadn't been stubborn. As Clara stepped onto the platform, her knees buckled, the strain of weeks without rest finally claiming its due. She barely heard the shout before the world tilted. James was there in an instant, catching her before she hit the ground, calling her name like it already mattered. The station staff rushed over, voices overlapping, someone asking if she was okay, someone else suggesting an ambulance. Clara protested weakly, embarrassed even as her vision blurred. James ignored her protests. He'd seen collapse before, seen what happened when people pushed past their limits, because no one had given them permission to stop. "She needs help," he said, voice firm enough to cut through the noise. Now, at the hospital, as doctors confirmed what he already suspected: severe exhaustion, dehydration, hypothermia, just shy of dangerous. He sat in the waiting room, longer than he'd planned to stay in the city at all, when a nurse finally told him she'd be fine, just needed rest. Something in his chest loosened. He left his number with the front desk, hesitated, then added his full name. It felt like crossing a line he'd sworn he never would. As he walked away, unaware of the headlines his name would someday make, he didn't know that Clara would look at that name later, eyes wide, heart racing, realizing the man who'd saved her from the cold wasn't just kind, or steady, or quietly powerful. He was a force. And somehow, against all odds, their lives had just collided. Clara woke to quiet, the kind that felt unfamiliar after years of alarms, monitors, and rushing footsteps. The hospital room was dim, curtains half drawn, snow drifting past the window like a world moving on without her. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was or why her body felt so heavy. And then the night came back in fragments: the cold bench, the coat, the man with the steady eyes, the train rocking beneath her feet. She shifted slightly and noticed the flowers on the side table, simple white lilies with a card tucked between them. The handwriting was careful, restrained. "Glad you're safe. Rest, James." Her heart did something strange at the sight of his name, a quiet tightening she wasn't ready to examine. The doctor later told her she'd been pushing herself toward a breaking point for months, that she'd been lucky someone intervened when they did. Clara nodded, ashamed and relieved all at once. When she was finally discharged 2 days later, she expected to step back into her life unchanged. But nothing felt the same. The city seemed louder. The hospital hallways felt narrower. And when her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number asking simply, "You doing okay?" she stared at the screen longer than she meant to before replying yes. She was, and thank you. His response came almost immediately. "Good. If you need anything, say the word." It was the kind of offer most people made without meaning, but something told her he meant it completely. They met again a week later, for coffee that turned into hours. James listened as Clara talked about nursing in ways that surprised her, about the small victories that never made headlines and the losses that stayed with you long after your shift ended. He told her about land, about seasons and responsibility, about how you didn't really own anything, you just took care of it until it was someone else's turn. It wasn't until the barista recognized him, voice suddenly too polite, that Clara felt the shift. The woman glanced between them, eyes wide, then hurried away, whispering to a coworker. Clara frowned. "Do you know her?" she asked. James exhaled slowly, like a man who'd been delaying a truth and finally ran out of road. "She knows of me," he said. He didn't elaborate, but later, when Clara Googled his name out of idle curiosity, her breath caught. Articles filled the screen, profiles, interviews, headlines calling him a legend, a visionary, one of the youngest self-made millionaires in the region. Photos of sprawling ranches, awards, charity work she'd never heard him mention. She felt foolish, embarrassed by how easily she'd believed he was just a man who worked land. When she confronted him, her voice shook despite her effort to keep it steady. "Why didn't you tell me?" He met her gaze without flinching. "Because I wanted you to know me before you knew my money," he said quietly. The honesty in his voice made it impossible to stay angry, but it didn't erase the distance his wealth suddenly created in her mind. That distance followed her. For weeks, an invisible line she couldn't seem to cross. Clara told herself it was practical, that people from different worlds didn't build lasting things together. That history was full of stories that proved it. James felt it too. Though he didn't push, he showed up when she invited him and gave her space when she pulled away. A patience born of years spent waiting on things you couldn't rush. The breaking point came not with an argument, but with an act of quiet generosity. Clara's mother called in tears one night. The house, condemned after a fire sparked by faulty wiring, insurance refusing to cover the damage. Clara sat on her bed, phone pressed to her ear, panic clawing up her throat. The next morning, James drove her home without asking questions. By the time they arrived, crews were already working, permits approved, materials delivered. Clara stared, in disbelief. "What did you do?" she whispered. James's voice was gentle. What needed doing? The weight of it hit her all at once, not the money, but the intention behind it. She realized then that his wealth wasn't a wall, it was a tool, and how he chose to use it mattered more than how much of it there was. That night, As they stood in the cold air watching sparks rise from welding torches instead of from a fire, Clara reached for his hand first. History shifted again, quietly, the way it always does before anyone notices. Love did not arrive in Clara's life like a celebration. It arrived like responsibility. It settled into her days quietly, in the way James remembered the exact hour her shifts ended and timed his calls, so she wouldn't feel rushed, in the way he never tried to pull her out of the hospital world she belonged to, but instead learned its language so he could stand beside her in it. Yet the closer they grew, the heavier everything else became. Word traveled fast in small cities, and faster still when money was involved. People noticed the black truck parked near the hospital entrance. They noticed the way James waited, never honking, never stepping inside unless invited. Whispers followed Clara down hallways she'd once walked unnoticed. Some were curious, some impressed, some sharp with judgment. She heard her name paired with his in tones that suggested calculation instead of affection. And each time it happened, something inside her tightened. James felt it too, though he rarely spoke of it. He had lived under scrutiny long enough to recognize its shape. What he hadn't expected was how fiercely he resented it when it touched her. He wanted to shield her, to build a fence high enough, to keep the world out. But Clara wasn't something to be protected like land or cattle. She was a force in her own right, and the more pressure pushed against her, the straighter she stood. Still, the strain showed in small ways, the pauses before holding his hand in public, the hesitation when reporters began to ask questions, the exhaustion that settled deeper than physical fatigue ever had. The breaking point came quietly. As most real ones do, a story ran online, framing Clara as a charity case turned romantic curiosity. A nurse rescued by a millionaire cowboy as if she had not spent her entire adult life rescuing others. She read it alone in her apartment, anger and humiliation twisting together until she couldn't tell them apart. When James arrived later that night, she handed him her phone without a word. He read the article once, jaw tightening, then again, more slowly, as if memorizing it. "I can make this go away," he said finally, voice low. It was an offer, not a threat, but it landed wrong. Clara shook her head. "That's the problem," she said, tears burning. "You can make things go away. I can't." The words hung between them, heavy with truths neither had wanted to name. For the first time since the station, James didn't know what to say. He realized then that loving Clara meant accepting her pride, her independence, her refusal to be rewritten by someone else's power, even his. That night, instead of fixing things, he listened. He let her rage and grieve and fear spill out without interruption. And when she finally went quiet, he said the hardest thing he knew how to say. "Tell me how to stand with you, not in front of you." Something in her face softened then, and the distance between their worlds shrank just enough to breathe again. History began paying attention not because of who James was, but because of what they did together when a winter storm overwhelmed the local hospital. James quietly funded temporary housing for stranded staff without attaching his name to it. When Clara organized volunteer nurses for rural clinics that had gone without care for years, James provided transportation and supplies without cameras or speeches. People noticed the pattern, not the money, but the intention. A millionaire cowboy and a nurse weren't supposed to rewrite narratives, but they did. One unpublicized act at a time, the story shifted. Less spectacle, more substance. By the time the spring thaw arrived, Clara realized she no longer felt like she was standing in James's shadow. She was standing beside him, casting her own. On the anniversary of the night they met, James took her back to the old train station, now quieter, nearly forgotten again. He didn't kneel. He didn't give a speech. He simply took her hands and said, "Whatever history makes of us, I want to make a life with you." Clara thought of the cold bench, the coat, the man who had stayed when he could have walked away. She thought of everything they had carried and chosen anyway. When she said yes, it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Somewhere beyond them, unseen and unstoppable, history wrote the final lines in ink that would not fade. The wedding was not the spectacle people expected, and that alone became part of the story. There were no cameras lining the road, no exclusive interviews, No glittering guest list curated for influence. It took place on open land beneath a sky so wide it made even the wealthiest man present feel small, exactly the way James liked it. Clara wore a simple dress, no veil. Her hair braided the way it was on long shifts when she needed it out of the way. And when she walked toward him, she did so without hesitation, without fear of being seen for who she was. The vows were brief, spoken in voices that carried easily in the open air. James promised steadiness, truth, and presence. Clara promised courage, honesty, and partnership. No one used the word forever, but everyone felt it. In the months that followed, their lives didn't slow down the way fairy tales suggested they should. If anything, they became fuller, heavier with purpose. Clara continued nursing, eventually leading programs that reshaped rural healthcare access. James remained rooted in the land, expanding his work not just as a businessman, but as a steward. They argued sometimes, they failed sometimes, but they never confused power with worth or money with meaning. And that distinction, small as it seemed at first, began to ripple outward. It was years later that people started calling their story historic. And even then, it wasn't because of romance alone. It was because of precedent. A nurse who refused to be elevated above her profession, and a millionaire who refused to use love as a pedestal. Together, they challenged something quiet, but deeply ingrained, the idea that salvation came from status instead of solidarity. Their train station meeting was riddled in articles, speeches, classrooms. Some romanticized it, some tried to dissect it, some dismissed it as luck. But nurses remembered it differently. So did ranch hands, small-town doctors, families who'd benefited from programs built not on charity, but on partnership. When asked in interviews what had changed his life the most, James never mentioned success or wealth. He always said, "A night I almost kept walking." Clara, when asked how she'd managed to carry so much responsibility without burning out again, always answered, "I learned that strength doesn't mean standing alone." History took note not because they were perfect, but because they were deliberate. In a world obsessed with rescue narratives, they chose something harder: mutual recognition. Long after the old train station was demolished, replaced by something modern and forgettable, the story remained. It was told to new nurses on their first exhausting shifts. It was told to young ranchers who believed they had to choose between success and decency. It was told not as a fairy tale, but as a reminder that history isn't always made by loud moments or grand gestures, but by ordinary people making uncommon choices when no one is watching. Somewhere in the telling, details changed. The cold grew colder, the coat heavier, the pause longer, but the truth at the center never did. A man stopped, a woman endured. Neither knew the weight of what was beginning, and because they chose to stand together instead of apart, something rare happened. Love didn't just change their lives, it changed the way people believed love could look. And that was the kind of history no one could erase.